Hello and welcome to a brand new series of Cairns Catches Up. Tom Cairns in the position as we discuss with fellow guests in the world of motorsport about their careers, the challenges that they've sort of faced during their time, and and what it means to be involved in the motorsport world and where it all began for them. The first guest I've got on board is a man who has more recently been involved in the punditry side of things for both F1TV and for NBC Sports within IndyCar. It's a Mr. James Hinchcliffe. Good evening, sir.
Hello, hello. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent indeed. So, how things have been with you? Because it's a long time since we've seen you on a racetrack racing, but it's me more on the sort of journalistic side of things with what you've been doing with NBC and with, of course, with F1TV, particularly this year and last year, of course. And yeah, in general, how have things been with you?
Yeah, great. Busy, that's for sure, but good problem to have, right? Like you say, the driving bit's kind of taking a bit of a back seat. So I still do some endurance racing, some sports car stuff in the IMSA series, kind of doing the enduro races here in North America, but most of my weekends, 26 or something weekends a year are spent talking about other people driving race cars. So it's been a fun transition, like you said, doing the full IndyCar schedule with NBC, and then starting back in 22 with 3 races, and then last year with 6 races. This year I'll be doing 8 races with F1TV. That's kind of been another fun thing to add into the calendar.
Yeah, absolutely so. And obviously, as much as you've been heavily involved in the IndyCar side of things, your love for Formula One is certainly no secret. And I think that leads on to the question is, how do you compare IndyCar to Formula One from your perspective?
It's so funny. If you look at the bare bones of it all, they're very similar, right? They're 94% the same sport. It's single seater, open wheel race cars. It's, a mix of racetracks, road courses, street circuits. It's a lot of the same things. Key differences, obviously, being that every team's designing and building their own chassis from scratch every year, and you're using, one of the several engine manufacturers. Technology is quite a bit higher, budgets are quite a bit higher, but at the end of the day, it's just we're going racing, and that was actually kind of relief for me, as you say. I mean, I've been a Formula One fan my whole life, as I've been an IndyCar fan my whole life. I'm just a fan of motorsports, and when I first started working with F1 TV, I had a bit of imposter syndrome, if I'm honest, because I've never raced in the series. I haven't even tested an F1 car. An Indy car, I raced it for 11 seasons. And so it was kind of natural to jump behind the mic and talk about it. And with F1, a lot of it was new to me. But I very quickly realized that racing's racing, and 94% of it is the same. And so I did my homework and grilled a bunch of people that I know. I've got some friends in the paddock from over the years of the sport, and managed to get, enough information out of them to feel like I could at least pass for, someone with some knowledge of the sport, and, relied heavily on guys like Jolyon Palmer and David Coulthard. Working with them has been a blast on the F1 side. So no, it's been interesting kind of getting to work both series.
Yeah. And of course, with IndyCar, in terms of the moniker itself, I think it sort of changed around about 1996 from where it once used to be, and then it sort of became kart champ or whatever it is, during the days of Cristiano D'Amato when he was racing it before he got the jump into Formula One. But in terms of IndyCar as a series that's been watched all over the world, given the number of different representatives from, likes of Alex Palou from Spain, Helio Castroneves from Brazil, and of course those from the UK, Jack Harvey, for instance. How have you seen IndyCar sort of grown more around the world in the last like 10 years or so?
Well, yeah, I think there's been a couple factors. I think kind of two big ones. And the first was, like you say, there was this divide in US open wheel racing for a long time with the kart IndyCar split. Those two series merged back in 2008, but that was because one was failing. The other one, honestly, it was kind of the last one to I guess the first one to die. It's not really that either were being particularly prosperous. It was both were struggling, but one held on longer than the other. So they finally merged. 2008, as you remember, not a great year for things like sponsorship. Was the global financial crisis, tightened every purse string of every company around the world. So it really entered a really difficult rebuilding phase for IndyCar. So now you fast forward, from there, let's say 6-ish years to get to kind of 10 years from now, when the series really started to pick up some steam. We had some good title partners. A new car had just come out. New manufacturer had just jumped in. So from there, the series has sort of been steadily growing. And I think that's just due to a great international flair. Like you say, we have drivers from all around the world. And the on-track product is just great. There's just no two ways about it. IndyCar racing is great wheel-to-wheel action. It's tough for the drivers. It's exciting for the fans. And it's hyper competitive. So I do think it's been kind of organically growing a bit on its own. And then I'm one of the believers that, rising tides lifts all ships. And so as Formula One really kind of had this boom starting, back in whatever it was, 18, 19 with the show and then particularly over COVID, I think that introduced a lot of people to motorsports. And I think once you kind of fell in love with F1, a percentage of them started looking for other motorsports to enjoy, and IndyCar is a great alternative. I know certainly in the UK with the deal we have with Sky broadcasting all the races, that's a huge deal. And so yeah, it's been kind of great to see IndyCar on the up in the sort of last 10 years. It's a slower pace, a slower growth, no doubt, but definitely going in the right direction.
Yeah. And you mentioned about drivers coming, sort of from the junior series, i.e. Indy NXT, formerly known as Indy Lights, and those from Formula 2, like Callum Ilott, for instance, graduating. And you look at how Formula 1 is right now, how competitive it is in even getting a seat, let alone compete very, very well in it. And you see a lot of Formula 2 graduates go into IndyCar because they feel it's an alternative of racing in Formula 1. Do you think the arrivals of those particular sort of personalities has helped shape IndyCar as a commercial entity?
I think the groundwork has been set for that. It's all kind of still relatively new. Guys like Lundgaard and Ilott were sort of that first wave. We've had a few more come over, your Marcus Armstrongs, drivers like that. Maloney, you just did a test for Ray Hall a couple weeks ago. Teo Porcher's obviously been in the car. So we're starting to see that influx of incredibly talented drivers from F2 and over in Europe, that there's just, as you say, it's so limited in the opportunities in F1. There are 20 seats, period. Best case scenario, one day there might be 24, but that's where the rules of the sport stop it from going. So to if you're in that sort of world and the timing's just not right with contract cycles for other drivers, et cetera, you've got to find alternatives. And IndyCar is a tremendous alternative for those drivers. So it's great seeing them come over. It's definitely great to add that kind of talent level to the championship. And yeah, I do think it does start to open some doors commercially. Most importantly, in my opinion, would be to really start going down the path of international races again. We do have drivers from all over the globe now, a lot of European drivers. It would be great to get back there. You've got, a Mexican and Pato Award doing incredibly well. It would be awesome to see a race down in Mexico. We've got a couple Kiwis and a couple Aussies, so it's great to toy around with the idea of maybe going back to Surfers Paradise or somewhere down in that part of the world. So I think that's hopefully where it's all heading, is this influx of drivers from outside of North America is hopefully going to open up some commercial possibilities for the series itself to move outside of the continent.
Yeah. I mean, talking of which of racing internationally, where would be most feasible for IndyCar to go and race in? Let's say in Europe, for instance, because Europe is very much a core sort of part of the world when it comes to any form of motorsport, especially Formula One, because that's where pretty much all the Formula One teams are based in.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's like I said, there's some North American and South American options that I think would be great. Mexico and Brazil were kind of two we already mentioned, but when you start talking about Europe, man, I mean, the opportunities are endless. Obviously the UK has a ton of racetracks. even if we couldn't go to Silverstone for whatever reason, there was a race, the cart went to Brands Hatch back in, I think, 2003, maybe. Now they ran the Indy circuit, which was a joke, but if you run the full Grand Prix circuit at Brands in an Indy car, that would just be phenomenal. And I think you'd get a massive turnout. I think you'd have a great race. The drivers would love it. The teams would love it. So I mean, that's a great place to start if you're looking at, expanding the calendar towards Europe.
Yeah. And that takes me on to my next point, because I think you raced in Brands Hatch before,
Mm.
representing Team Canada in A1GP, the World Cup of Motorsport. What a championship that was, hey?
Oh man, to this day, I mean, you still find us old A1ers littered around the racing world. And whenever we run into each other, we sit there and always just, reminisce about the good old days of A1GP. That championship was incredible. And, over the last, I mean, what's it been, 15 years probably, uh, you hear all these rumors of maybe somebody wanting to start it back up or get it going again. It's not happened yet, but I pray one day it does, because that championship was the best.
Yeah. I mean, going on to your sort of IndyCar racing career yourself, you've seen a lot change in those 11 years. Obviously, we had the sort of windshield, that's sort of, in fact, if you want to call it that, or the windscreen, as some
Yeah,
people may
the
call
aero
it.
screen, yeah.
The aero screen, yeah, there we go. I mean, IndyCar, as we'll know, is a dangerous sport to me. I mean, to be fair, any motorsport is in that sense. But when I think of IndyCar, about the sort of difficult periods, let's say, obviously we had the death of Dan Weldon in 2011. I think it was in the same year as when he won the Indy 500 as well. And of course, Justin Wilson, the former Minardi and Jaguar Formula One driver. And I think that particular sort of incident had kind of prompted the new concept of this aero screen, so that when debris does get flicked up by another car, the aero screen just flicks it away, just as it does with the halo for Formula One.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, racing open wheel cars on ovals is definitely a more dangerous, endeavor than a lot of other forms of motorsport. And anyone that races IndyCar acknowledges that and accepts that, and you go about your job. But the series is always looking at ways to try to keep drivers safer. Safety never stops, because motorsport will never be 100% safe. So you will always strive for that, even if we kind of already know it's an impossible goal. You will strive to minimize those risks any way you can. And whether it was things like the Hans device or things like the safer barrier, or now of course the aero screen, those are all big developments that have come out of IndyCar racing. And the aero screen in particular, yeah, Justin's accident was it was a real catalyst. It was so tragic, and it was just so unfortunate. And it was a conversation that had already been happening, having not just something that was the halo, but we did want to take it a step further, because on those high speed ovals, even small pieces of debris that could fit through the opening of a halo can do some serious damage. And I was actually on the receiving end of something the year prior, excuse me, at a road course. A bit of a front wing got hit off in a collision in front of me, and the angle at which it came at me would have gone right through the hole of a halo, and it hit me in the helmet and knocked me unconscious, in the middle of a straightaway doing 160 miles an hour. So I think IndyCar always had this dream of it being that sort of extra step in terms of safety, and you've got to give them credit. It's been a tremendous addition from a safety standpoint to the series, and you can look back and probably already count a half dozen very serious injuries, if not worse, that it has prevented. So there were complaints about how it looked at first. The from inside the cockpit, it definitely made things hotter and less comfortable. But I don't think anybody would want to race without it, having now had the opportunity to see what it can really do.
Yeah. You've had some wonderful moments during your career in IndyCar. Obviously, you won 6 races. I think one of them was in St. Petersburg. Sao Paulo was another one. Iowa, Long Beach, and I think Iowa again in 2018, your most recent victory. Have there been other great moments where perhaps your racecraft sort of came into it?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, there were a few races that stood out for me that didn't end up, in victory lane. Things like Texas 2016 was one that I was really proud of, even though we finished second. Um, the Fontana race in 2014, I want to say. So again, one of those races where you did a lot of things really well, and you can be proud of the results. Podiums, a couple times in my home race in Toronto was always something I was really happy about. So yeah, that's what's interesting about racing, right? Only one driver wins, but there are often some very notable days that other drivers have that don't get the same sort of, attention externally. But, as a driver, you really do kind of take those days almost as well as a win, because statistically you're never going to win as many races as you lose, and so you've got to get that that motivation and that validation from some of those strong results that might not be a P1.
Yeah. I mean, you've also sort of competed in other championships. Obviously, there's teams in IndyCar you've raced for: Newman Haas Racing, Andretti Autosport, and the Shrimp Peterson Motorsports team. Now, Andretti is obviously a name that's been talked about for many reasons, particularly their sort of determination to get on the Formula One grid eventually, which I think it will eventually happen. It's just a matter of which, or as a matter of when it will happen. But you've obviously seen Andretti sort of be successful somewhat in IndyCar and in NASCAR and other championships like Formula E, for instance. Jake Dennis winning the Formula E championship a year ago with them. Can you see Andretti making it to Formula One?
Absolutely. I absolutely can. And I would love to see it. I don't know of many fans that wouldn't like to see more competition on the grid. And especially, a team that comes with that kind of, racing pedigree behind it and history behind it. And, essentially with the way it's structured now, if that's how it all happens, it would bring in another manufacturer as well. So it really is a net gain all around. I think there's about 10 people that don't want it, but they all run Formula One teams at the moment. So it's a tricky situation. But no, I have full faith that the process will work out the way it's supposed to. And there's a reason the Concord Agreement has it, revisioned for 12 teams and 24 cars. That's what this sport has always supposed to have been about. And it would be great to see them on the grid.
Absolutely so. And I perfectly agree with what you say, because there simply isn't enough seats in Formula One. At the moment, there's 10 teams and 20 drivers. I think this is the 8th year in a row where it's been like that. And you look at the standards of driving talent coming through Formula 2 and Formula 3, and perhaps even in IndyCar and Indy NXT, because we have seen some drivers sort of, instead of going into the Formula 1 paddock, they end up going into the sort of IndyCar paddock. Drivers like Louis Foster, for instance, who has raced in the UK in GB3 and GB4, I believe. Talents like that are what Formula One needs. And in order for these seats to happen, there needs to be more teams involved, but not just teams to make up the numbers, but competitive teams that can actually challenge for points each and every race weekend. In contrast to that, when we had Caterham, Mauritia, and HRT back in those days before those teams eventually fell by the wayside, it's what Formula One needs. So, and I think there's obviously a finance thing involved in terms of how the championship prize money gets distributed across the teams. So this goes on to my question. If you were in charge of Formula One, what would you want to sort of maybe change?
Oh, in general,
Yeah. Well, on the sort of sporting front, let's say.
on that side of things, yeah. I mean, uh, look, I think that expanding the grid is just massively beneficial. So that'd be the first thing would be to make that make that happen. I know you can't just let anybody on the grid. And you kind of go back to those 3 teams you mentioned that didn't survive. That was a very different era of Formula One. I think the 2 big things that have changed are you have the cost cap. And so you don't have these smaller independent teams coming in trying to go against at the time, I think Toyota was spending $500 million a year. And even they weren't that competitive, to be totally honest. So, but now with the cost cap, you don't have to walk in with an endless amount of money. Don't get me wrong, it takes a significant amount of investment and financial backing to make it happen. But on top of the reduced cost, you have a much more commercially viable championship. And going out and actually getting those sponsors is it's by no means easy, but it's certainly a much different conversation than it was 20 years ago. So I would love to see that. Obviously F1's a pinnacle of technology. It's great to see them pushing the boundaries and the technology side. I I'm very curious to see what this new generation of car does and how the new rules package really plays out. But I am also one of those ones that looks at the way sustainable fuels are developing. And my hope among hopes is that we can go back to a, internal combustion engine, something V8-ish maybe with 1,000 horsepower, but it can be carbon neutral running on sustainable fuels. And not to say that hybrid technology is not valid and necessary for the transportation industry, but this is racing, and racing's supposed to be visceral. It's supposed to be loud. It's supposed to be, pushing the limits. And I think the sound more than anything is one of the things that fans and drivers and everybody is missing from like the V8 and the V10 eras of the sport. So, I mean, those are a couple things off the top of that. We could spend over an hour just on these things, but
Yeah.
there's obviously a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, absolutely so. And whilst Formula One may be sort of working on trying to find options as to how they allow new entries coming onto the Formula One grid, it's also about where they go as well, because there is obviously a love affair that Formula One has in the US. We've now got 3 races, one in Austin, one in Miami, and the more recent one in Las Vegas. How do you assess Formula One's plans in where they go to at the moment, and how you assess the idea of having 3 races in the United States?
Look, the United States is a big country, and it certainly has the appetite for it. That's got the population for it, and I think if you look at those 3 events, they're being proven right. You know, as someone who's based in the U.S., you look at the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the NFL, right? American football is the biggest sport in the country, and those teams play, I think it's 16 regular season games a year, 8 at home, 8 away in the same city, around 32 different cities, 8 times a year. You're pretty much selling out a stadium. So the argument that you can oversaturate the market, I don't think is a fair one. Or I don't think it's a valid one. I think that you can more than easily accommodate 3 races. I mean, I think you could do a fourth. I don't think they should. This is a global championship, and putting too many races in one place is not really in the spirit of it all. But no, I think F1's expansion has been very interesting to watch, and the selection of certain venues, whether it's in the States or otherwise, has been interesting to watch. But having worked a little bit in the paddock and having made a lot of friends now with a lot of people in the paddock, the thought of going beyond 24 races is terrifying, I think, to everybody that works in Formula One. But when you read comments and hear things said by people at FOM, it seems like they're not done. They don't want to stop. They want to keep going and keep growing. And I think there's a human cost that needs to be taken into consideration at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously been sort of in love with Formula One for a very long time in your life. Is there sort of any idols that you had growing up to become a racing driver yourself?
For sure. I mean, as a Canadian, I was a big fan of the Canadian drivers. So even though I never saw him race, Gilles Villeneuve was always one of my absolute heroes. And then, of course, I followed Jacques' IndyCar career very closely and his transition to Formula One very closely. And I don't think I've screamed louder at a TV than I did in Jerez in '97. So, there was definitely some passion behind following, Jacques' career. And then honestly, there's been a lot of drivers that I've loved watching over the years, but in terms of the ones that sort of inspired me as a young kid, it was the Canadians. It was, say, Jacques and Gilles. It was certainly Greg Moore over on the IndyCar side. I cheered a lot for Paul Tracy as well when he was kind of the guy in the early 2000s. So those are some of my big ones in terms of as a kid who I looked up to the most.
Excellent. And obviously, you've not sort of raced in Formula One at all, but which would you say would be your favourite tracks, and where would you want Formula One to go to in the near future that's not currently on the calendar right now?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I mean, the favorite tracks, I think, even though there are 2 tracks I've not driven that I have to at some point in my life in something, and that's Spa and Suzuka. And I think if you pull the drivers that have raced around the world, be it Formula One or other championships, those 2 tracks are going to come up in, most drivers' top 3 tracks in the world, I think, more often than not. But as far as tracks that F1 doesn't go to, but they should. I mean, I'd love to see what an F1 race looks like at Road America. I know we just talked about not having a fourth race in the States, but and it certainly doesn't have the infrastructure for an F1 race. It's not a realistic thing, but that's one of those incredible old school racetracks that I would love to see a Formula One car race at. Um, Man, that's a tough question because they obviously have such an extensive schedule and are already going to many of the greatest in the world. I was definitely happy to see Imola come back onto the schedule. That was one that I kind of missed for a bunch of years. Um, yeah, that's tough. I don't know. I still think Road America is the best one they haven't been to.
Okay, well that's fair. I mean, like you say, obviously infrastructure is a huge part of putting together a solid racing circuit and help to accommodate fans who are there. If you look at places like Silverstone, for instance, in terms of the fan zones, I think fan zones are obviously a huge part of a motor racing weekend. Doesn't matter what series it is, whether it's the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the Indy 500. I think there is like some fan zones over at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. In fact, that takes me on to my next point. Actually, is the Indy 500 one of the most watched events across the whole motorsport year? It's been going on since 1911, but when you think of the Indy 500, what's the very, very first thing that comes into your head?
It's just the history. I mean, you said it there. 1911, this race started. It's been raced over 100 times. It is the biggest single race in the world. It's the largest single day sporting event on Earth. And it really is unlike anything else out there. And you talk to people, so like it's bias coming from me, right? And I acknowledge that. I'm fully aware of that. As hard as I try to not be biased about it, it's there. What does it for me is a guy that I've had the pleasure to work with on the NBC broadcast. His name is Mike Tirico, and Mike Tirico is one of NBC's, lead anchors in sports. He does everything from American football to Olympics. I mean, he literally just got back from Paris. He has seen Wimbledon's, the Masters, Super Bowls. He's seen it all. And even he will say that there is something so uniquely special about the Indy 500 and that it is one of the greatest sporting events that you can attend. So it's such a unique event, but for me, what really sets it apart is the history of it all.
Absolutely so, and we've seen some wonderful races of at the Indy 500 over the years. I think particularly the last couple of years, or the last few years, in fact. Joseph Newgarden winning the last two, and Marcus Ericsson, despite the late red flag, was able to hold his nerve and come out on top and win his first ever. The former Caterham and Sauber Formula One driver coming out at the top. And that's the thing, like even when you look at drivers who have raced in Formula One that weren't exactly aces, if you want to put it in those words. They were okay, but not to the sort of levels where Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton are at. They go into IndyCar, and then we start seeing the real, true potential of what they are like behind the wheel of a single seater of the highest caliber, like IndyCar, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the unique things about Formula One, right? I mean, every driver on that grid got there off the back of some impressive performances in their junior career. But F1 itself is just so unique, in especially in years past. Kind of looking back to Marcus's time, for example, anything pre the budget cap and the wind tunnel restriction rules and everything like that, the disparity between the teams was just enormous. And so you could take one of the most talented junior formula drivers and put them into the eighth best team, and they're going to finish somewhere between 12th and 16th every weekend and look very underwhelming. But that's not necessarily a true measure of their ability. And so, some people like to look at drivers that maybe haven't had a ton of success in Formula One who come over to IndyCar and all of a sudden are very successful or comparatively much more successful and look at that as, an indictment on the talent level of the drivers in IndyCar. But, my rebuttal to them is simply, no, it's an indictment to the disparity between teams in Formula One. Again, this is a conversation for a few years ago. Now it's obviously converged. It's much closer, but uh, 7 winners in Formula One hasn't happened in over 10 years, I think.
Yeah,
I think it was 12 years
yeah. I
ago.
think it's 12 years. Yeah,
Yeah. And so we regularly have 8, 9, 10 winners, different winners in a year, every year. So it's great when those drivers get the opportunity to come over and come into a championship where every driver has a more kind of level playing field to play on and has better opportunities to win races and be competitive. And they've come over here and made some great lives for themselves. Guys like Grosjean, guys like Ericsson, Barrichello came over for a while. Montoya came back for a bit after his F1 and NASCAR stints. There's just something so pure about the racing in IndyCar. I think it does attract a lot of drivers, and I think it brings the best out in a lot of people as well.
Yeah, and I think also age doesn't necessarily come into it. It doesn't matter whether you're in your early 20s, arriving on the back of how you've done in Formula 2 or Formula 3 or Indy NXT, or whether you're in your 40s, like Scott Dixon, for instance. Scott Dixon, the most successful IndyCar racer of all time, still performing at the top of his game. And you can almost compare that to, let's say, how Lewis Hamilton's getting on, who turns 40 in January, but still winning races. So it just goes to show that if you have the true belief in yourself, in terms of the true fitness and having the team behind you, you've got the car underneath you. There's every chance that you can still win.
No, absolutely. And certainly experience plays a big part in this championship, and having to master 4 different types of tracks between road courses, street courses, short ovals, and super speedways. That kind of schedule does kind of lend itself to giving a little bit of an advantage to the experienced drivers. And yeah, if you're willing and able to put in the effort to maintain the fitness, like you say, at that age. I mean, it's kind of like Alonso, right? I mean, if Alonso was in a race winning car, he'd be winning races the same way that, Scott's with one of the best teams and still performs at the highest level. Um, he's a unicorn in a lot of ways. I think kind of like Fernando is, and Lewis is showing to be as well. I mean, Lewis's success obviously speaks for itself, but to still be winning races and still be as driven and hungry at his age with his success, especially, is incredible.
Absolutely so. And with IndyCar's calendar, or in fact this year in IndyCar, how have you seen 2024 going in IndyCar? Because they're close to finishing this season. They finish in September for those of you who are not familiar with IndyCar, but it does finish in September normally. I suppose it's a weather thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit of that. It's also it's really hard to draw in audiences on television once fall hits because Sundays are football. So it does definitely affect the TV side of things. So that's a big part of why the schedule is structured the way that it is. But yeah, we have 5 races left coming off kind of our inadvertent summer break. F1 gets a summer break every year. We got one this year because of the Olympics. And yeah, it's been a great championship so far. A lot of different winners, a lot of competitors, contenders, a lot of controversy. It's been on track and off. There's been all sorts of storylines to follow, and it is definitely a fun championship to not just be a part of, but to follow along as a fan because there's always a lot going on.
Yeah, and it's kind of the same over here in the UK because over in the UK we've got what you would call soccer. We call it football over here, but obviously with like the Premier League beginning in August and then finishing in May, and that's why we have the London E Prix, the Formula E race in London at the London Excel. And it's just simply because when there's so much sport going on at the same time, it's very difficult for fans to sort of get in and out the stadium, getting on the public transport or whatever, especially when you're in London, because in London, it's a very busy place. And if
Yeah.
you're a London resident, you're better off just using the public transport as opposed to just driving to get to where you want to go. Because the public transport in London, you could easily get the tube on the London Underground every like 2 or 3 minutes on whichever
Mhm.
line you get it from. I don't know if you experienced that yourself in London, but
Yeah, I
that's just
have.
the
Yeah.
fact that, yeah, I suppose that's a similar thing in places like New York as well, that there's always
Mhm.
like a tube coming in every 2 or 3 minutes. So then, F1 TV. You've been doing it for the last few years. I believe you did 6 last year and 2 or 3 the year before, and you mentioned you've got 8 this year. I think you've only done like 1 or 2 so far, but of course you'll do a lot more once the IndyCar season has reached its conclusion for 2024. from your experience, just sort of describe it for me and what it's like being in the paddock with there being so many fans supporting sort of their teams and drivers, and of course the love affair between themselves for Formula One.
Yeah, no, it's been a remarkable experience. Big credit to everybody at F1 TV for the effort that they put in. For me, as someone who's relatively new to the television game, it's fun getting to do something completely different from IndyCar in the sense that with IndyCar on NBC, it's network television, US sports broadcast is a very specific type of broadcasting. There is a formula to it. It's tried, tested, and true. And that was obviously my sort of introduction and what I've done most of. Coming over to the F1 TV side, F1 TV it's a streaming service essentially, right? It's the app, and you have a different set of rules you can kind of work under than when it's network broadcast. And so for me, it's been really exciting getting to see that. And yeah, I mean, the access obviously that you have, you're in the paddock, you're on the grid, getting to kind of see all the excitement, really feel the energy of those races. And it's awesome seeing how every race kind of has its own personality and its own sort of vibe. The favorite one I've done so far has definitely been Mexico City. Just the way that those fans turn up is amazing. And, you talk about the fans in the paddock supporting their drivers. I mean, it's pretty hard to get a paddock pass in Formula One. And in Mexico, Checo had to have a series of bodyguards around him just to walk from the garage to the team hospitality because every fan in the paddock was a Checo fan. And it's just remarkable to see the support that each country has for the drivers and especially ones that are the hometown heroes. But no, it's like I said, it's an incredible group of people that I get to work with, in the booth beside Alex Jakes and whether it's Julian Palmer or David Coulthard, and then everybody that we work with, down in the pits and in the pre and post shows. It's a tremendous team, and I'm really fortunate to get to be a part of it.
It's very much a team effort as well to sort of get the whole production side of things set up at an F1 race weekend. I don't know how NBC sort of go about in terms of the production side of it, or IndyCar in general, because I'm sure IndyCar have their own sort of production team that sets up the cameras and everywhere else, and NBC is just one of the broadcasters that show it to the fans. But you look at the camera work within Formula One in terms of like the gyro cams, for instance. Gyro cams are sort of a relatively new feature this year where the camera just sort of sinks down, but almost to where the driver's seat is. And it's a rather more dynamic sort of view than the generic onboard view with the driver. Do some of the sort of camera angles sort of strike you a little bit compared to how IndyCar works, or is it sort of similar to where IndyCar is at?
No, honestly, a lot of it's quite similar. The gyrocam is certainly a newer feature and one that is unique to F1 and I guess MotoGP. But no, it's motorsports television is a very tricky thing. And it is, it takes the work of some very talented people to, the directors helping figure out where camera positions go, and then the camera operators, how to use them. The onboard stuff's obviously always a fun thing to watch. I do like the way that, F1 kind of utilizes the obstruction of the halo to its benefit by sort of putting the heads up display information when you're on an onboard, over top of that. Stuff like that is quite cool from a TV production standpoint. The use of cable cams and drones and things like that seem to be getting more and more prevalent, and that's something that's very, fun to see. The helmet cam that, we used to do it in IndyCar. I think it started back in the early 2000s, and it's fallen out of favor for some reason, but I love the way that F1's doing it. I hope that IndyCar brings it back at some point, because it's the best way to really give the fans the true look of what it's like from inside the cockpit. The camera on top of the roll hoop doesn't really do it justice. What you're seeing from that eye level, the way the vibrations are, how much information's on the dash for the drivers, all that stuff. It's really fascinating to see, and it's cool to see that they're utilizing it that way.
And whilst cameras may be a sort of glittering part of motorsport, and that's part of what makes the show it is, it's why the fans watch it. You think about places like Las Vegas, which is the kind of area you expect to see brilliant camera work at, but as a venue which made it back onto the Formula One calendar for the first time since the days of Caesar's Palace in the early 80s. I suppose we've only sort of been back there once since, but in terms of its future, do you see it going from strength to strength, both from an entertainment point of view and from a sporting perspective?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there were obviously a lot of questions going into that race last year and a lot of skepticism going into that race. And I won't lie, I was on that program too. There was a lot of things I was unsure about how it was going to play out, but ultimately, short of that issue that we had in first practice, which is actually fairly common for street tracks to have some kind of, track related issue. It's unfortunate that it damaged a car the way that it did for Carlos, but the race itself was awesome. I mean, it was a great, great Grand Prix. The event, I think there are some things that you can tweak and make a little bit different to improve the fan experience, and that's something that just comes with time, and you can't. It's really hard to make a new event, especially a temporary circuit, an absolute home run in year one. That's almost impossible to do, but I was pleasantly surprised. I think a lot of people that worked it were pleasantly surprised. And I think any fan that watched the race was pleasantly surprised at what the end product was. I do wish they tweaked the schedule a little bit. That was brutal. That
Yeah.
was really tough for anybody working it. And even for fans, it was weird times on TV pretty much everywhere in the world. It didn't really make sense anywhere. But I know it's the same for this year. These things take time to kind of iron out the kinks. But again, that's an event that I could see continuing to grow, and as they kind of figure out some of the bigger logistical struggles of holding a race where they're holding it, that it could grow into a very big sporting event for the city.
Yeah, absolutely so. And with the news that Lewis Hamilton's going to Ferrari, we've seen news that Carlos Sainz is going to Williams as well. Big Hulkenberg on the move from Haas to what will be Audi in 2026, but for now is Sauber. And whilst the calendar may not change too much next year, it'll be the same 24 venues, albeit in a rather slightly different order. We're going to Melbourne first for the first time since 2019. Do you feel that 2025 will be different in a way where we're going to see more than two drivers in contention for the championship?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot on. Just, as any rules package converges, you see more and more contenders, appear. And while it's tough to predict which of the top four teams is going to be the one that really nails it next year, I do think you're going to have four teams and eight drivers that are all very close to each other, and all contenders for wins. And so if you can consistently be fighting up front and podiums on good days and top fives on bad days, you're going to be in a shout for the championship. So I do think it's going to be a much, much closer battle than what we've seen the last few seasons.
And I think it should also have that element within IndyCar where victories are not what should decide a championship, even though in some aspects it should. But it's points that are going to win the championship. If you've got four or five drivers, or even six, depending on how the teams get on next year, a fourth place or a fifth place may sometimes feel like a victory in a way because you finish ahead of your nearest rival in the championship, which I suppose is what has been going through Max's mind a little bit. If he finishes ahead of Lando Norris in the race, it's usually a good result now. Whereas during the days of 2021, when it was him and Lewis fighting for the title, finishing second would not usually be a good result.
No, I think you're exactly right. And that is sort of the mentality that you have to win a championship in IndyCar, because there are so many drivers that can be competitive, and bringing home those results in the top 5, top 10 when you don't have a race winning car are so crucial. Finishes outside the points in F1 are what's really devastating to a championship campaign. DNFs are devastating to a championship campaign. One of the stats that I love to look at as an analyst now, it's something that me and my co-analysts in IndyCar, Townsend Bell, talk about all the time, is best worst finish. And that seems to be a really good indicator of who the strongest, contender for the championship is, because if you've got, those same good results as everybody else, but your bad days are better, that's what's going to make the difference. Because your Max Verstappen, your Lewis Hamilton, your Lando Norrises, they're all going to win 2, 3, 4 races, whatever the number is. They're all going to be probably in that same realm, but it's who brings home the fifth instead of, crashing out trying to pass for fourth and getting no points on the day, that I think kind of makes a difference at the end. So it is going to be really fascinating the second half of the year. And then, yeah, certainly already looking forward to 2025.
And what contributes to the points as well is the sprints. Now, sprints have been a relatively new thing, which has divided opinion amongst fans. Just from your perspective, because we've had a number of them now, this is the fourth year with this sprint, although they've sort of switched around in terms of the race weekend structure for that. Do you see it as a positive thing with this sprint thing? Do you see it as like it adds more significance to a race weekend as opposed to having an extra 2 practice sessions?
It definitely adds some. Look, here, I do think what I will say right off the bat is the current format is by far the best one that they've had. So they've made them significantly better over, how they were in 2023. The things about them that I don't like are that it almost gives you too much of a preview of the Grand Prix. I realize that now without Parc Fermé post sprint, you can make changes and improve your car, but it still gives you a little bit of a sense of what the pecking order is going to be, which when the cars are as close as they are right now, kind of ruins a little bit of it. Drivers don't celebrate sprint wins because it doesn't really matter. They like the points, but if you were to give out the same number of points for being, fastest in practice as you did for a sprint race, they would probably be just as happy with that because it's not the race. It's not what drivers are going for. So from the driver's perspective, I don't think it's really beneficial. I don't think it's particularly valuable. But from the fans' perspective, it does bring a lot more action to the Grand Prix weekend. From the promoter's perspective, you are encouraging people and giving people a reason to come out on Friday, to come out on Saturday, in a way that you really weren't quite the same before. So I get it. I can't say that I love it, but I certainly understand, why it's gone that way. I hope it doesn't end up being something that we do at, half the races. And I mean, at this point, you might as well try something like a reverse grid because that would at least, hide some of the potential pace of different cars for Sunday and make Sunday still a little bit more of a guessing game than what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. And what would you change with the sprint format? Would you maybe change how many laps there should be, how many points there should be awarded, how the grid gets this? I mean, you mentioned reverse grid there, but where do you set the reverse grid? Because I think the trouble with that would be some teams may start sort of playing around with the rules a little bit because whatever happens involving the sprint no longer has a bearing on the core part of the race weekend, and that's the race itself.
But I mean, that's how it is currently, right? It's the Saturday is sort of an isolated day for the sprint, and you can damage a car and not have to worry about. Oh no, wait, no, it's different, right? You qualify Saturday morning's the sprint race, right? And then Saturday afternoon's Grand Prix qualifying.
Correct.
Right. So, yeah, I guess that's one thing that's a bit of an issue is you might be concerned of taking a big risk in the sprint race for fear of damaging your car and not, having everything fixed and be able to participate for the Grand Prix qualifying. I don't know. I don't know what the fix is because again, fundamentally as a driver, I'm not for them. So I don't know what to do to make it better. Unless, why don't you just take points out of it and just make it like a crazy big prize money fund for all the sprint races?
Perhaps even
So
like a separate sprint championship.
for sure. So yeah, sprint points go towards the sprint championship. I know that's something that's kind of been talked about, but then again, just the drivers just won't care. The sprint champion won't really be celebrated, and nor will they really want to celebrate. And it's going to go on your CV, but it's not going down in the history books. It's just not the same. You kind of have to either have, one or the other. I don't know. It's tough. sprint races and reverse grids are obviously a format that are prevalent in the junior categories, and you kind of do them your entire career going up to F1. So maybe there's an argument for still doing it in F1, but it's one I haven't quite wrapped my head around how to make work and kind of beneficial for all yet.
Yeah. In terms of Formula One's future, more locations have been discovered. I mean, we've seen some simulated images of Qiddiya in Saudi Arabia. There was a thing or two about Turkey that was reported by particular sources. We mentioned about where Formula One should go to in the future. I mean, South Africa sort of fell through the net because I think Formula One were meant to be going there last year until the funding for it just fell through from South Africa's perspective. I mean, with 24 races right now, do you really see the calendar expanding to like another number, or do you see 24 or 25 being the maximum capacity?
I mean, again, just looking at the human cost of doing any more expansion seems like a bit of a risk. But that certainly doesn't seem to be the tone of the people in charge of making the calendar. So yeah, I mean, maybe the alternative is, and as I know this has been discussed, is certain venues go into a rotation, year on, year off with another venue, and they get Grand Prix every other year. That's a way to add new countries, new tracks, new venues without adding more races. That might be something worth exploring if that's a way for the sport to grow, but without really just the people involved in the sport ultimately paying the price.
Yeah. And as for me, as a Formula One fan myself for the best part of 20 years religiously, I'm all for going to new venues because it helps bring fans together, particularly the younger generation. With the way Formula One is globalized at the moment, I think it needs to have that. But it's just where they go to that is sustainable. I don't feel that Formula One would be interested enough in going to places where it's only going to be like a 2 or 3 year deal with the uncertainty of as to whether it's going to extend. They're going to go to places where they know that they've got a long-term future over that circuit, particularly like a 5 year deal or a 10 year deal like we've got with Miami or Abu Dhabi. Qatar is another one as well. In fact, the Middle East in particular is another one that's fast growing compared to what it was like 20 years ago before Bahrain was the first country in the Middle East to host a Formula One race. So I think it comes down very much to, I suppose, money is king, isn't it?
You got to follow the dollars. That's kind of how it works,
Yeah,
unfortunately. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it'd be interesting. I know Rwanda's now being discussed as a potential one, with South Africa falling off and to still get on the continent somehow. Um, but yeah, it's again, until there's a solution to the people problem, it's going to be hard to support expansion past what we've got. But like you say, a lot of these new contracts, these promoter agreements are 10-year deals, so they are kind of solidifying the future of certainly a significant core number of races. And then maybe you can afford to have five or six that are maybe a little less long-term secure and try them out for new venues and new places and see which ones stick.
yeah. About going back to more about you, I mean, in terms of your racing career, who would you say you sort of learned the most from that helped you become as successful as you have been during your days in IndyCar? Who would you say is the first thing that comes into your head?
Well, I mean, the first person I'd give a lot of credit to is my very first race engineer, Craig Hampson. If we're not talking just drivers, if we're talking anybody in the paddock, he was a tremendously successful engineer. He ran Sebastian Bourdais to his 4 kart titles. He'd worked with Newman Haas basically since right out of college, and I just got lucky by having him on my car in my rookie year. And then I also got to work with him again my second year at Andretti, which was my most successful year of my career. Um, and yeah, he's just an incredibly intelligent guy, an incredibly experienced guy, and really helped me understand the ins and outs of the sport, what's required, not just on track, but some of the off track stuff and interacting with the team and things like that. Um, And then driver wise, I had the opportunity to work with some great teammates. Oriol Servia was my teammate my rookie season. I learned a ton from him, as I think any driver would on your rookie year. Ryan Hunter-Reay is another driver that I got along very well with and spent a lot of time with and learned a lot from. So yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate. I've been uh, surrounded by some really cool people. Even before I got to IndyCar, Dario Franchitti was a bit of a mentor to me, and he kind of stayed that way in my first few seasons and kind of up to his retirement. So yeah, I've been fortunate to be around a lot of really good individuals and have the opportunity to learn off a lot of really bright people.
Yeah. And I mean, you've won all those races in IndyCar as well. St. Petersburg, as I've mentioned, Iowa has won where you won twice at, and as well as being a quality racing driver, I believe you're a quality dancer as well. Yeah, I think you know where this is leading to, don't you?
Yes.
Dancing with the Stars, USA, 2016, runner-up in that. Um, just maybe describe the experience from your perspective, because I used to be, when I was younger, I used to be a Strictly Come Dancing fan,
Right.
particularly because of the TV personalities there. We had some really good broadcasters, which someone in particular who's sadly no longer around now, um, but just from your eyes, how was the experience being on a particular show like that?
It was awesome. I mean, it was a fantastic experience. It was terrifying. It took a lot of convincing to get me to do it. It was an incredible amount of work. They grossly undersell how much work it is to be on that show and be part of that deal. But no, it was awesome. I had a great experience. Met some really really cool people. Made some lifelong friends. Um, have a whole new appreciation for the world of dance. And I mean, hey, we finished second, man. I mean, I sit for a living, and finish second in a dance competition is not bad.
Yeah. Which would you say was your favorite um, dance? Was it the foxtrot? Was it the Argentine tango? What was it?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked the kind of more frame dances, less so the Latin dances. I'm a 5'10" white guy from Canada. My hips don't move well for the Latin dances. So things like foxtrot, tango, Argentine tango, those ones were probably my favorite kind of style.
Yeah. And I don't recall. I think Len Goodman there, one of the judges when
Yeah.
you were there. Sadly, no longer with us now.
Hmm.
But yeah, he must have been someone you got on very very well with, who was obviously a very popular figure over in the UK. Um, Others you got on well with, other dancers as well, and I'm sure the audience pretty much enjoyed what you were doing to get yourself to that runner-up position.
Yeah, no, honestly, everybody was great. Some of the other people on the show I got along well with. Calvin Johnson Jr., who's a big American football star. He was a great guy. He and I kind of hit it off and came kind of close. My dance partner and I became very very tight. As I did a lot of the pros help out all the different people that are on the show, and got to work with a few of them in different capacities, which was great. So no, it was a really, really cool experience. Met some really cool people. Did something I'd never thought in a million years I'd ever do in private, never mind in front of, 10 million people on television live. But hey, you gotta make yourself uncomfortable every once in a while, right?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes being out of your comfort zone for a little bit may be the sort of best way to go to sort of show your true self sometimes, because as much as people know you for who you are for your main occupation, doing something a little bit different is suppose a good thing, right? So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, as for myself, being a, a broadcast journalist and a commentator myself, I used to be involved in music. So I used to be involved with sort of playing acoustic guitar and singing as well. As I'm a big sort of like indie alternative rock band fan myself. Are you? What's your sort of taste of music?
Uh, I'm pretty eclectic. I like good music. That's kind of my cop out answer, right? I'm not too picky on genre. If it's a good song, if it's well written, I can kind of get behind anything, but I would say I'm kind of like classic rock would be if you were to put a gun in my head and pick one genre that I've got the most kind of affinity for, it'd probably be that.
Yeah, and as for myself, I do follow a lot of the sort of American stuff as well. I mean, there's obviously big rock bands like the Killers. Who else have you got out there? Boston. Boston's another good one as
Mhm.
well. I mean, for a
Yeah.
particular tune they've got there. And obviously, there's a lot of the UK stuff. I mean, I've mentioned Stereophonics is a big band that I'm a huge
Mhm.
fan of. I've been a huge fan of them since I was younger, and I don't know if any of the sort of UK sort of music has drawn your attention to. I'd like to think you have done that. But going back to the sort of IndyCar stuff then with NBC Sports, which leads me on to my question. If you were to go back, let's say 15 years, so your sort of junior days, in terms of what would have feasibly been different for you, what would you have done differently?
Oh man, is it going back with the knowledge I have of today?
Well, either back then or what would you, like, in other words, what would you maybe change?
You know, there was this one kind of turning point in my career in IndyCar where it was sort of a crossroads in terms of what the next step was team wise and things like that. And there was an opportunity that kind of presented itself that I really wanted that sort of fizzled out for various reasons. And it's one of those things that in hindsight, I had put more effort into fighting for to make it work. I think that it would have been a great fit. And I think that I was maybe knowing what I know now, maybe a little bit, narrow-minded in sort of the reality of some of the barriers that were in front of me to make that deal happen. And I wish I had just pushed a bit harder because I think if I had, we could have got it done. And I think if it had gotten done, it would have changed a lot of things. But it's not to complain. I had a great run, 11 years in the series. I stepped away when I was still physically able to do so, and despite some scary incidents in my career and things like that, had some success, had a lot of great opportunities, met a lot of great people, got to do a lot of great stuff. So certainly not complaining. But yeah, there's always things you look back and wish you could maybe take one step different and see how things turned out.
And combining this with my next question as well, what are your plans professionally for the next 5 years? Are we going to see you back in a race car anytime soon?
Yeah, so I'm doing Petit Le Mans and IMSA here in October, coming up in a few months, and the plan is next year to continue with FAF Motorsports with the McLaren 720 and IMSA, and be doing some more GT3 racing. I really enjoy the endurance stuff. I always have. I did the Daytona 24, I don't know, 5 or 6 years in a row when I was running IndyCar. It was a nice kind of tune up in January before the season started, and now kind of being back in it on a part-time basis rather than just a one-off. That's been a lot of fun. So I think getting to do the broadcasting stuff, which I fully accept and understand, is I've got more broadcasts in front of me than I do races, most likely, hopefully. Or maybe the better way to say it is more races behind me than in front on that side. It's been really nice to kind of balance those two things and get to still enjoy being part of IndyCar, being part of Formula One, but then also from behind the wheel, scratch that itch as a competitor and be part of a team with FAF and try to go for those results in the IMSA races. So it's yeah, definitely I think more sports car stuff in the foreseeable future.
Well, James, it's been absolutely brilliant having you on the show. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully one day we'll cross paths with each other within the motorsport paddock, wherever that may be.
Absolutely. Sounds great. And thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. Thank you very much.